I spent most of my life trying to find happiness outside of Islam because, you know, like I don't know, some people go through a stage in their life where they're like, no, God, I don't need you.
Yeah.
It seems like you're saying all these things that I have to listen to, but I don't have to listen to it. So, for example, God would tell me to be grateful. It's like, no, I'm going to try to be successful CEO. And then I'm going about my secular life trying to be a successful CEO. And then I open top 5 things to help you become a CEO. Number 1, be grateful.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And I'm just like, wow. And then, another one. Don't want what others want. God tells me that. No, God, I don't want to listen to you. I want to go through my secular life.
Yep.
Number 2, don't want what others want. Focus on you.
Yep.
Okay, so all these self-help books are telling me exactly what my God, my creator has been telling me this whole time. And a lot of Muslims, especially in the West, fall into this, where they believe that the only way to escape their identity crisis and the only way to escape who they are is by not being themselves at all.
Yeah.
And some of them go on to, I saw this one Netflix show. I don't even remember what it's called. I don't want to remember what it's called because this is what they did. So they want to, because now the liberal movement that she talked upon, now they're inviting Muslims in. And they're saying, oh, yeah, you know, Muslims are on our side and we're with Muslims and all this stuff. But the problem is that they're determining how our propaganda and our agenda is going. So what they would do, for example, is in this Netflix show, this girl would take off her hijab and she leaves home, and you know she's escaping from her parents to be a Westerner. And it's like, well, you're not helping at all like this, and you're actually making things a lot worse for us than actually helping us.
100%, bro. You've hit on something that's massively important, which is one, as Muslims, even as Western, even if you're like Western, white, atheist, you have to have a critical perspective about dominant narratives. So one of the dominant narratives is about this, like, again, we talk about freedom, but also under freedom, this has been a lot of, like, I study religion in college and grad school. The word secular oftentimes means white. Okay. And you have to be careful about following that line of thinking, because oftentimes no one in the kind of narratives you're talking about, you'll very rarely see a show that's asking someone to be more secular and be more Arab, be more secular and be more Indian, be more secular and be more black. It's always the secularity that's presented is of like white people. And you have to understand, like, we have to be deeply, deeply critical. One of the things that happens, like, if you're very honest with ourselves, anyone who, like, if you're Afghan or Arab or whatever, the more secular atheist you become, the less Afghan you become. And you have to question why that is. I've never seen an Afghan or an Arab who leaves religion and becomes atheist and keeps their cultural practices too. Why is that? Like, your cultural practices of, like, the food you eat, the way you dress, like Afghans and Arabs have like a certain cultural dress from back home. You very rarely see an atheist from that community wearing those clothes. Why is that? Those clothes aren't Islamic necessarily. Those are cultural clothes. But because the reason is a lot of what is being asked of you is to become more white. And that's the undertone. And we have to be, on one hand, even if you're atheist, like, you have to be really critical of a white supremacist narrative. You have to be really critical of a narrative that asks people to become a certain way. This has happened over many generations to many different people. This happened to Jewish people. Jewish people had a very distinct cultural practice. Now, a lot of Jews were white. They've lost a lot of that. And it doesn't have anything to do with religion. It has very specifically to do with, like, a dominant kind of, this is what's normal, quote unquote.
And actually, a lot of Jewish rabbis claim that that is the #1 issue facing Jewish Americans today.
It's something that faces black people. It's definitely something that faces white people. It's definitely something that faces, like, any kind of minority. In the 20th century, we know that there's a lot of immigrants that came. They're Irish, they were Polish, that were Jewish, that were Russian, that were Ashkenazi Jews, that were, like, a lot of people who had very distinct cultures and practices. Now they're all white. What does that mean? Like, there's a total erasure of people's culture, of people's lifestyle, of people's values. Now, on one hand, when we talk about like, okay, how do we kind of merge these two, right? And that's a question I kind of forgot to get to earlier, was values are not culturally specific. Values are universal. And this is something that like I had a hard time coming to terms with like growing up, right? As you see this conflict of values. And for instance, like you said, like being grateful is not culturally like irrelevant to America. Now, it is irrelevant in the sense that most people today have a very like materialist understanding of the world. There is a sense in the West, generally speaking, where people don't understand how to talk about things that are not material. For instance, gratefulness, happiness, love, spirituality, even things like passion, emotion. Westerners generally have a hard time talking about those in a very real way. You might have some groups here and there, but it's never talked about in school. It's never talked about at universities. It's never talked about in the dominant kind of media discourse. When have you ever seen a media narrative about love? When have you ever seen like a kind of show, or not like a Netflix like here and there show, but like a real thing that discusses like, things like belonging, love, emotion. These things that are internal are very hard to talk about in these kinds of settings. And so it's difficult, but like for me, it's like it started with having an understanding of what is real and what is not. Like, how do you come to terms with the kinds of evils that are happening in the world, and which parts of those evil are invisible, and which parts of those. So one of the things that like these kinds of racial narratives does, I know, sorry, I'm like jumping on like a lot of tangents here, but for instance, like there's a deep evil that's happening where billions of dollars are being robbed from ordinary people through different nefarious tax practices, different nefarious banking practices, different nefarious. So if you go to like anywhere in the Midwest and the South, like in Idaho, Utah, if you go to not Utah necessarily, but like Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, these communities have been completely ravished by economic despair. There's companies that have come in and destroyed these communities through many different ways, but no one ever talks about that in the media. That's not an evil that's been done. Yet why is the evil that they're imagining like these Muslims who are coming in and taking their jobs and stuff and doing stuff? And what I'm saying is like you have to be critical of what your own people have done to you. Like you have to be critical of like, this is like white supremacist capitalist narrative that's happening. That's very hurtful to a lot of people in a lot of communities. It's hurtful to Muslims. It's hurtful to everyone else, but it's not in the public discourse.
And I think what's interesting is that now is not only a white supremacist attack on Muslims, but it seems that there's actually even on the left, there's attack on Muslims.
Oh, yeah.
And it's happening in actually a much more discreet way than white supremacists go about it. So what I find is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but what I found is that white supremacists will attack us emotionally and physically when it comes, or verbally, while the left will kind of actually attack us through our principles. And it's kind of like, okay, now we have two attacks on both sides while we're trying to simultaneously integrate correctly without having the problem that the Jewish community is having.
Exactly. This is a great question, man. It's a great point. Malcolm X said this, Martin Luther King said this towards the end of his life, but Malcolm X said this from the very beginning, which was that you have to watch out for the liberals. It's like the people who are racist to you in your face that like, what they're about. Like you can very clearly see, but it's the other ones who try to stab you in the back that you have to watch out for. And this is, you mentioned you have a lot of atheist friends, you have a lot of Christian friends. And what I would say is like, you can be an atheist and be a really good person. You can be a Christian and be a really good person. You can be a Muslim and be a really good person. And on the other side, you can be an atheist who actually supports injustices. You can be a liberal or a conservative who supports injustice or justice. These categories don't necessarily tell you if you're a good person. Even if you're a Muslim, it doesn't necessarily say if you're a good person or not. There's many Muslims who grew up with just kind of the ideology. And like you said, there's many people who are atheists and very disciplined, very like hardworking, very, they care about justice and equity. And so that is not, being Muslim does not give you an excuse for anything. Like you can't just say, oh, like I have better values, I have a better this, and therefore I don't need to do anything. I don't need to like I don't need to contribute to anything. But to your question, like, we have to be very critical, I think, of injustice wherever it happens. And from the Muslim perspective, you have to be critical of the ways in which liberals will oftentimes support injustice. And that injustice a lot of times happens to where you force a community to go away from their values, to go away from their tradition, and become something else. And again, come back to this term of like whitewashing, right? Of like forcing a community to leave itself. And, you know, there's that issue you talked about is like a very complex thing. You can get down into weeds for it, but you have to, one of the central ironies, right, is that if you're a community that says we believe in freedom, we believe in justice, we believe in equality, and you don't like religion, as the liberals a lot of times don't, because you say it tells you what to do. It tells you what you should believe. It tells you what this and this and that.
It hinders rights and equalities.
The irony is the liberals become that. Don't you see? Like, they tell you what is human rights, what isn't. They tell you what is justice, what isn't. They tell you what is freedom, what isn't. So they become like a version of a religion.
Maybe.
So it's like, it's kind of funny because they say like, we don't want anyone telling us what to do, except if you don't do this, you're this, you're that, you're this.
You're this kind of person.
Yeah. So we have to be, I think, like, and then you have to, because no one ever asked that question of where do you get your values from? Like, where do the liberals get their values from? Where, like, what is your conception of justice? Yeah. What is your conception of equality? What is your idea of like freedom? Again, all these different things that people just say and throw it out there. So you have to break these terms down. Where does it come from? Why do you believe in this as opposed to this? And within those are like there's values about human beings that people believe in. So I think like you can believe in justice and equality without being dogmatic about it. And again, that comes back to like your own self and your own character. And one of the things that Muslims, I think, have a very rich tradition of is like, stop focusing on other people.
Yeah.
Like, worry about yourself. Like, how do you improve your own mental, inner, like, heart, you know?
And one thing is that I think one of the reasons why Muslims are so attracted to this liberal ideology is because it's the only one that's been inviting Muslims into the Western culture so far. And it's kind of like me and you have been discussing for a long time right now, how to integrate Muslims successfully. And by successfully, we mean without losing Islamic values into the West. But if that means us losing our Islamic values and that means liberals then accepting us, then we don't want it. We don't want to be accepted. Because I was actually talking to my sister about this, and she said something very cool, which is that what being American is about is being yourself. And if I'm being myself and myself is Muslim and myself is a practicing Muslim, then I'm actually being completely and 100% American.
Exactly.
And so I don't actually have to fall in line with either conservative views or liberal views, and I can actually just be myself.
Yep.
And I think that when I was watching your video helped me a lot, which is that how you asked the very important question of how can you navigate your personality through the West and, you know, the identity crisis. And it's kind of like, well, to all the youth out there and all the Muslims out there, just be yourself. And whatever yourself feels most comfortable in, that's what you got to do, and follow really what your religion and your heart tell you to do.